Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we step into a different kind of darkness, a world lit by flickering torches and thick with the scent of piety, ambition and, well, something else entirely. Imagine for a moment that you're a fly on the wall in a 15th century Castilian court. The air is heavy with incense, the rustle of silk and the murmurs of plotting courtiers. But there's another aroma, a more personal one, that clings to the tapestries and the very fabric of the grand gowns. A scent that whispers of a deep, abiding faith so powerful it led to a paradox that almost brought an entire nation to its knees. A paradox that centred on one of history's most influential figures, a woman who united Spain, bankrolled a voyage to a new world, and yet, by all accounts, was spectacularly, stubbornly and religiously unhygienic. You probably won't survive this. Not with the flies and the pestilence hanging in the air, but we'll get through it together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and the local time down in the comments. It's always fun to see where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the hallowed halls of the Alcazar of Segovia, a magnificent castle that seems to have sprung from a fairy tale. It's a place of breathtaking beauty, of intricate arches and sun-drenched courtyards. But this is no Disney movie. Your eyes, as they adjust to the dim light, are drawn to a figure seated on a carved throne. This is Isabella I of Castile, a woman whose name echoes through the centuries as a paragon of power, piety and purpose. She is dressed in rich brocade. Her face, framed by a delicate headdress, is a study in stern devotion. Her hands, clasped in her lap, are still, but you can feel the coiled energy of a born leader. Her presence is formidable, almost suffocating in its intensity. You might think, looking at her, that this is a woman who commanded everything, armies, kingdoms, the very destiny of a nation, and you'd be right. But you might also notice a subtle, almost imperceptible detail, a whisper of an odour that hangs in the air around her, a scent that speaks of things left undone, of a conscious rejection of the mundane comforts of cleanliness. This, my friend, is the heart of our story. The tale of Isabella is, in many ways, the tale of Spain itself. She was born in 1451, a time of turmoil and uncertainty. Her half-brother, Henry IV, was a weak and ineffective king, and the nobles of Castile were a rebellious and scheming bunch. From a young age, Isabella was a pawn in these political games, shuffled from castle to castle, a potential prize for any powerful lord who could seize her. But even then, a core of steel was forming within her. She was not content to be a simple piece on the chessboard. She was a deeply, almost fanatically religious girl. Her faith wasn't a casual Sunday affair. It was the very lens through which she viewed the world. God was her co-pilot, her confidant, her guiding star. This deep piety would inform every decision she ever made, from the mundane to the world-changing. It would also, as we'll see, lead to some truly baffling personal habits. One of the most famous and unsettling tidbits about Isabella, a fact that historians still argue whether it's a fringe rumour or an undeniable truth, is the legend of her undergarments. The story, which has been passed down for centuries, goes that Isabella once made a solemn vow to God. The details vary, but the core of the tale is this. She swore she would not change her linen undergarments until the kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, had fallen to Christian forces. The siege of Granada, for those of you not up on your 15th century Spanish history, lasted for an agonising 10 years, from 1482 to 1492. Now, I'm no mathematician, but 10 years without changing your underwear. That's a dedication to a divine promise that boggles the mind and assaults the nostrils. We have to understand the context here. This wasn't just a matter of personal preference. This was a statement of faith. In Isabella's deeply religious worldview, the body was a vessel, and the soul was what truly mattered. The pursuit of personal comfort, of what we would call basic hygiene, was seen as a worldly indulgence. To suffer, even in a small way, for the glory of God was a mark of true devotion. A dirty body was a holy body, a testament to a soul focused on higher things. This asceticism, this rejection of the flesh, was a common theme among some of the more devout mystics and saints of the era. They believed that by denying the body you brought yourself closer to God. Isabella, in her own way, was living this ideal. It was a strange and unsettling belief system, to be sure, and one that had some rather unpleasant side effects. Think about the sheer, unadulterated willpower this must have taken. Imagine the itchiness, the chafing, the sheer human misery of it. For 10 years, and not just any 10 years, but 10 years spent on campaign, moving from dusty encampments to drafty castles, surrounded by soldiers, horses, and all the attendant filth of a medieval army. The sheer fortitude required for such a pledge is, in its own way, breathtaking. You have to admire the commitment, even as you find yourself instinctively taking a step back. This single, peculiar detail tells you so much about the woman herself, her unwavering resolve, her unshakable faith, and her willingness to endure personal discomfort for what she saw as a righteous cause. The legend of her undergarments is, of course, the most extreme example of her asceticism, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Isabella's court was famous for its piety and its strict moral code. While other European courts of the time were descending into decadence and debauchery, Isabella's court was a bastion of solemnity. She banned gambling, she enforced strict dress codes, and she demanded a level of religious observance from her courtiers that was both admirable and, perhaps, a little exhausting. She saw her role not just as a queen, but as a spiritual shepherd, guiding her people toward salvation. Her personal habits were, in her eyes, a testament to this mission. Historians still argue whether the story of the undergarments is literally true or if it's a symbolic myth. Some sources claim it's a later fabrication, a malicious rumour spread by her enemies. Others, however, point to the very real evidence of her deep piety and her documented ascetic practices. They argue that such a vow, while shocking to modern sensibilities, would have been perfectly in character for a woman of her faith and determination. Whatever the truth, the story has stuck, and for good reason. It's a powerful metaphor for the contradictions at the heart of Isabella's reign. A woman of immense power who embraced personal poverty, a conqueror who sought spiritual purity, a ruler who unified a nation while refusing to wash her own body. This first glimpse of Isabella, a glimpse that is both inspiring and a little gross, is just the beginning. We've introduced you to the Queen and the peculiar rumour that surrounds her, a rumour that will, in our future sections, become a full-blown crisis. We've seen her devotion, her single-minded focus on God, and her willingness to suffer for her beliefs. But what we haven't seen yet is the world she lived in, a world of dirt, disease, and superstition. We haven't yet seen how her personal piety, when magnified by the power of the throne, became a dangerous force, one that would ripple out from her own unwashed body to affect the lives of thousands. We've only just scratched the surface of the grand and grimy story that is about to unfold. You're still there, right? Standing in the echoing halls of the Alcazar, the phantom scent of unwashed piety still hanging in the air. The image of the powerful queen, so resolute in her filth, is a hard one to shake. But to understand her, you need to rewind the tape a little, back to a time when she wasn't yet the formidable Isabella of legend. We need to go back to her beginnings, to the political and personal crucible that forged her into the queen she would become. Her life wasn't a straight shot to the throne. It was a winding, dangerous path full of betrayals and near misses. Isabella was born in 1451, a time when the sun was setting on the medieval world, and the first glimmers of the Renaissance were beginning to peek over the horizon. But in Castile, it felt more like a perpetual twilight. Her half-brother, Henry IV, was a king in name only. His reign was a messy tangle of rebellious nobles, financial crises, and rumours of impotence and illegitimacy. Henry's court was a cesspool of political intrigue, where alliances shifted like desert sands and promises were worth less than a common peasant's crust of bread. Isabella and her younger brother Alfonso were kept mostly at arm's length, their lives a constant lesson in insecurity. They were royal, yes, but their position was precarious. They were pawns, not players. This unstable upbringing, far from the decadent excesses of the court, had a profound effect on Isabella. It instilled in her a deep-seated distrust of the worldly and the profane. She found solace not in the fleeting promises of men, but in the eternal certainties of God. She was raised in a strict religious environment, steeped in the Catholic piety of the age. Her mother, Isabella of Portugal, was a deeply devout woman, though she eventually descended into a state of mental instability. But before that, she ensured her daughter's education was centred on scripture, prayer, and the lives of the saints. This was Isabella's curriculum, her moral compass, and it pointed her toward a life of unshakable faith. Now here's a quirky tidbit you probably didn't learn in history class. Isabella was also an avid falconer. She loved the hunt, the thrill of the chase, the brutal efficiency of the birds. This might seem like a contradiction to her pious ascetic side, but in her mind it wasn't. The hunt was a disciplined, solitary pursuit, a reflection of the single-minded focus she brought to her faith and eventually to her rule. It was an escape from the scheming of the court, a way to connect with a purer, more elemental world. This combination of fierce determination and quiet devotion would become her signature. As she grew older, Isabella's political value increased. Henry IV had a daughter, Joanna, but rumours swirled that she was illegitimate, hence the nickname La Beltraneja, implying her father was one of Henry's courtiers, Beltran de la Cueva. The Castilian nobility, ever hungry for power, seized on this rumour. They saw in Isabella a legitimate alternative, a chance to get a new, more pliable monarch on the throne. They offered her a deal. They would support her claim to the crown if she married a man of their choosing. Isabella, however, had other ideas. She wasn't going to be a puppet queen, a trophy wife for some noble's ambition. She knew, with a certainty that could only come from a deep belief in her own destiny, that she was meant for something more. She wanted to marry for power, yes, but on her own terms. The man she chose, or rather, the man she actively sought out, was Ferdinand II of Aragon. He was the heir to a neighbouring kingdom, a shrewd and ambitious prince. This was a move of pure political genius. By marrying Ferdinand, she wasn't just securing a husband. She was forging a powerful alliance, a union of two of the largest Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. But there was a problem. Henry IV, her half-brother, had other plans. He was desperately trying to keep the two kingdoms separate and saw the proposed marriage as a direct threat. He forbade the union. This is where Isabella's tenacity really shines. She and Ferdinand, now lovers and co-conspirators in a grand political gambit, decided to do it anyway. She had to flee the court in a disguised party, escaping Henry's watchful eye. It was a high-stakes escape worthy of a Hollywood movie. She rode across Castile, a young woman risking everything for her vision of a united Spain. They met in Valladolid in 1469 and were married in a secret ceremony. The wedding itself was a logistical nightmare. They didn't have the necessary papal dispensation to marry as they were second cousins. So they produced a forged papal bull, a document supposedly giving them permission. Historians still argue whether Pope Pius II's bull was a genuine mistake or a deliberate forgery, but either way it worked. The marriage was a done deal, a political masterstroke that set the stage for centuries of Spanish power. With Ferdinand at her side, Isabella was no longer just a pawn. She was a contender. Henry IV, furious and feeling betrayed, disinherited her and named his supposed daughter Joanna as his heir. When Henry died in 1474, the stage was set for a civil war, a brutal conflict for control of the Castilian throne. Isabella, however, was ready. She was not a warrior queen in the sense of leading a charge on horseback, but she was a masterful military strategist and a brilliant logistician. She mobilized her forces, commanded her generals, and used her formidable intelligence to outmaneuver her opponents. The war dragged on for 5 long bloody years. Through it all, Isabella's piety was her rock. She believed with all her heart that her cause was God's cause. She saw her victories not as military triumphs, but as divine affirmations. When she finally defeated her enemies in 1479 and was proclaimed Queen of Castile, it wasn't just a political victory. For her, it was a spiritual one. It was proof that her faith, her quiet suffering, and her unwavering devotion had been rewarded by the Almighty himself. It was a dangerous kind of certainty, a belief that her actions, no matter how harsh, were divinely sanctioned. This, my friend, is a key piece of the puzzle. This is the origin of the mindset that would lead her to believe that refusing to wash herself for 10 years was a holy, rather than a repulsive act. This deep piety, this conviction that she was a divinely chosen instrument, became the foundation of her entire reign. It was the engine that drove her unification of Spain, her relentless campaign against the Moors, and her fateful decision to fund a certain Italian explorer with a crazy idea about sailing west to find the East. But it also had a darker side. Her belief in her own divine right meant she was completely inflexible, unwilling to compromise on matters of faith. This fanaticism would lead her to establish the Spanish Inquisition, a brutal institution designed to root out heresy. It would also lead to her bizarre and dangerous personal habits, which, as we'll see, had a far more earthly and catastrophic effect than she could have ever imagined. So you see, the woman on the throne wasn't just some randomly pious monarch. She was a survivor, a political genius, and a devout believer who had earned her crown through a combination of shrewdness, courage, and a deep, almost mystical faith. Her life was a testament to the power of belief, a belief that, in its most extreme form, led her to reject the very idea of personal cleanliness. Her undergarments, or lack thereof, weren't just a weird quirk. They were a symbol of her struggle, her victory, and the uncompromising nature of her soul. This is the Isabella we must understand, a woman who saw her own suffering as a form of prayer, and who, in her own strange way, believed she was cleansing her soul by letting her body decay. And with that, we're ready to see how this faith and the man she married would change the course of history forever. The air around you in the castle is thick with the weight of history, a silent testament to the long and arduous path Isabella took to the throne. But that throne, and the power that came with it, wasn't hers alone. As we've already touched on, she needed a partner, a man who was her equal in ambition and cunning. Enter Ferdinand II of Aragon, the clever and resourceful prince who became her husband. To understand Isabella's reign, you have to understand this dynamic duo, a partnership so powerful it would reshape an entire continent. Ferdinand wasn't a romantic hero in the classic sense. He was a pragmatist, a master of political manoeuvring, and a formidable military strategist. He was born in 1452, just a year after Isabella, and his upbringing was just as steeped in the hard realities of power politics as hers was. While Isabella was finding solace in her faith, Ferdinand was learning the brutal art of war and diplomacy from his father, John II of Aragon. He was a quick study, learning to be ruthless when necessary and charming when it served his purpose. He was, in short, the perfect counterbalance to Isabella's spiritual intensity. Their partnership was a classic case of opposites, attracting and working in perfect harmony. Isabella was the symbol of Castile, the deeply pious monarch who commanded the hearts and minds of her subjects through faith and force of will. Ferdinand was the wily statesman, the military brain, the man who could navigate the tangled web of European politics with effortless grace. Together, they were a force of nature. They ruled as a kind of dual monarchy, famously agreeing to the Concord of Segovia in 1475. This agreement ensured that their kingdoms would remain separate in name and law, but that they would rule Castile and later Aragon together as a single indivisible unit. The motto of their shared reign, tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, literally they amount to the same, Isabella and Ferdinand, perfectly captured the essence of their equal, if not always easy, partnership. Their personalities, however, could not have been more different. Isabella was famously solemn, a woman of deep gravitas who took her responsibilities with an almost crushing seriousness. Ferdinand, on the other hand, had a reputation for being more jovial, more approachable. He was a womanizer, a man of the world who enjoyed the pleasures of the flesh far more than his wife did. This created a fascinating tension in their court. On one hand, you had Isabella's ascetic piety and moral rigidity. On the other, you had Ferdinand's more worldly, pragmatic, and sometimes scandalous behaviour. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's numerous affairs were a source of deep conflict, or simply a tolerated, if not accepted, part of their political arrangement. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared ambition, not on starry-eyed romance. A quirky, and perhaps telling tidbit about Ferdinand is that he was a master of disguise. He would often sneak out of the palace, dressed in common clothes, to spy on his own subjects and gather intelligence firsthand. He was a king who was not above getting his hands dirty, a stark contrast to Isabella's more removed, divinely ordained presence. This willingness to engage with the world on a more granular, human level made him an incredibly effective ruler, especially in matters of war and diplomacy. He was the one who personally led the Castilian armies, a charismatic and courageous figure on the battlefield who inspired fierce loyalty among his troops. Their first big project together was the unification of Spain, a project that was, in their minds, both a political necessity and a religious crusade. They saw the Muslim kingdom of Granada, the last remnant of Moorish rule on the peninsula, as an affront to God and a direct threat to the stability of their kingdoms. For 10 years they waged a brutal, relentless war of attrition against Granada. This was the war that, according to legend, inspired Isabella's famous vow about her undergarments. While Ferdinand was on the battlefield, Isabella was in the background, a brilliant logistical commander, ensuring her armies were well supplied and well funded. She sold her own jewels, hawked her family heirlooms, and raised taxes to finance the war, a testament to her unshakable belief in the cause. The siege of Granada wasn't just a military campaign, it was a deeply symbolic struggle. The city was a marvel of Moorish architecture, a centre of learning and culture, and a final stubborn bastion of a different faith. When it finally fell in 1492, it was a moment of profound significance for the Catholic monarchs. For Isabella, it was the culmination of her life's work, a divine reward for her piety and suffering. You can imagine the scene, the triumphant entry into the city, the beautiful Alhambra Palace now flying the Christian standard, the joy and relief of a decade-long war finally over. And somewhere in the middle of it all a queen, 10 years removed from her last clean change of linen, basking in the glow of a divine promise fulfilled. The fall of Granada, however, was not the end of their religious crusade. In fact, it was just the beginning. The conquest of the Muslim kingdom was followed almost immediately by a series of decrees that would forever tarnish their legacy. They expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492, a devastating act of religious intolerance that forced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. They then turned their attention to the remaining Muslims, offering them a brutal choice: convert to Catholicism or be exiled. Or B. This was the dark side of Isabella's unwavering faith, a fanaticism that saw no room for religious pluralism. It was a policy driven by a belief in the necessity of a single, pure, Catholic Spain, a vision that would define the nation for centuries to come. This period also saw the rise of the Spanish Inquisition, an institution that, while officially under the authority of the Church, was effectively a tool of the Crown. Its purpose was to ensure the purity of the faith and to root out heresy, particularly among the newly converted Jews and Muslims, who were suspected of secretly practicing their old religions. The Inquisition was a terrifying and brutal institution, an echo of Isabella's personal zealotry writ large across a nation. It was a clear and unambiguous statement that in Isabella and Ferdinand's Spain there was only one path to salvation, and it was the one they had chosen. So, as you stand in the grandeur of the Alcazar, you see not just a queen, but a king, and a kingdom they forged through a combination of brilliant strategy, religious fervour, and a willingness to be absolutely ruthless. Their partnership was a masterpiece of political calculation, and it laid the foundation for Spain's golden age. But it was also a partnership built on a bedrock of religious intolerance and a fanatical quest for purity, a quest that would, in the case of Isabella, become an all-consuming obsession. We've seen her rise to power, we've seen her partnership with Ferdinand, and we've seen the beginnings of their religious crusade. Now we need to look closer at the ideology that drove it all, the ideology of purity, both religious and personal, that would eventually have a very physical and very dangerous consequence. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the stench of a holy obsession is about to get a whole lot stronger. Welcome back. We're still standing in the glow of Isabella's triumphant reign, the air around us thick with the sweet smell of victory, and the faint, unsettling aroma of her personal beliefs. We've explored her early life and her power-couple partnership with Ferdinand. Now, we need to delve deeper into the engine that drove their most brutal policies, their deeply held and increasingly fanatical belief in religious purity. This wasn't just about consolidating power, it was a crusade, a holy war fought with both steel and sanctimonious rhetoric. The unification of Spain wasn't just a political act, it was a spiritual one. Isabella and Ferdinand saw their mission as a divine one, an effort to create a single, unified Catholic kingdom. To them, the presence of non-Catholics, specifically the large and prosperous communities of Jews and Muslims, was an affront to God and a threat to the soul of the nation. The year 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus set sail, was also the year of the Alhambra Decree, a royal order that gave Spain's Jewish population a choice: convert to Catholicism or be exiled. The decision was devastating. Tens of thousands of people, many of whom had lived in Spain for centuries, were forced to leave their homes, their businesses, and their history behind. This wasn't a unique phenomenon in Europe at the time, but the sheer scale of the Spanish expulsion was shocking. It was a clear and unambiguous statement. In this new, unified Spain, there was no room for religious diversity. The logic was simple, at least in Isabella's mind. A kingdom could not be whole if its people were divided in their faith. She believed that God had chosen her and Ferdinand to lead this great spiritual cleansing, and she was not about to waver. Her piety, which had been her solace as a child, had now become a fearsome weapon. A quirky and rather dark tidbit about this time is the fate of the conversos, the Jews who chose to convert to Catholicism rather than leave. Many of them were suspected of being crypto-Jews, secretly practicing their old faith in private. This suspicion, which was often fueled by neighbourly disputes and personal vendettas, led to the creation of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, you might think of the Inquisition as some kind of medieval version of a police force, but it was far more insidious than that. It was a tool of both the Church and the state designed to enforce a terrifyingly strict orthodoxy. Its methods were brutal, its reach was vast, and its purpose was to ensure that every single person in Spain, at least on the surface, was a true and devout Catholic. Isabella and Ferdinand were the architects of this system. They appointed Tomás de Torquemada as the first Grand Inquisitor, a man whose name has become synonymous with religious intolerance. Torquemada was, by all accounts, a zealous and ruthless man, completely dedicated to the idea of a pure, unblemished faith. He saw it as his mission to root out any hint of heresy, and he did so with terrifying efficiency. The Inquisition's tribunals were a travesty of justice. The accused were often not told the charges against them, were not allowed to face their accusers, and were subjected to torture to extract confessions. The punishments ranged from public humiliation to imprisonment to, in the most extreme cases, being burned at the stake. Isabella, for her part, wholeheartedly supported the Inquisition. She saw it not as a tool of oppression, but as a necessary evil, a way to save the souls of her people. To her, a temporary period of pain and suffering was a small price to pay for eternal salvation. This is where her personal asceticism, the rejection of her own body, and her political zealotry, the persecution of others, become intertwined. In her mind, the quest for a pure soul, for herself and for her kingdom, was the highest possible calling. Her own unwashed body was a sign of her personal sacrifice, and the Inquisition was a tool for the spiritual sacrifice of her nation. This fanatical devotion to purity wasn't just a religious belief, it was a kind of ideology that permeated every aspect of her life. She believed in a kind of moral and spiritual hygiene, a rejection of anything that was deemed impure or worldly. This included the pursuit of pleasure, the love of opulence, and most bizarrely the act of personal washing. In her worldview, the body was a source of sin and temptation. To cleanse it was to indulge it, to pay it an attention it didn't deserve. This is a point where historians still argue whether her piety was genuine or a political tool. Was she a true believer, or was she simply using religion to consolidate power? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Her faith was genuine, but it was also a powerful justification for her most ruthless policies. The ultimate goal of this campaign was the creation of a limpieza de sangre, a purity of blood. This was a terrifying concept, one that suggested that a person's faith was not just a matter of belief, but of heredity. You were either born with pure blood, or you weren't, a belief that laid the groundwork for centuries of racism and discrimination in Spain and its colonies. This concept was a direct result of the persecution of the conversos, and the suspicion that their faith was not genuine. It created a society where your lineage, not your actions, was the ultimate arbiter of your worth. This obsession with purity, with a clean and unblemished kingdom, stands in stark and absurd contrast to the filth and squalor of her personal life. Isabella was a queen who demanded spiritual cleanliness from her subjects, while reportedly refusing to clean her own body. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was so focused on the purification of Spain's soul that she seemed to completely ignore the fact that her kingdom's physical body, and her own, were decaying. It's a contradiction that is both baffling and deeply revealing. It shows a mind so completely absorbed in the metaphysical that it had no time for the physical. So, as you stand there, in the very halls where these terrible and transformative decrees were signed, you can feel the weight of this ideology. The air is heavy not just with the scent of incense and old stone, but with the ghost of a fanatical belief that led to untold suffering. We've seen how Isabella's piety was forged in her childhood, how it was amplified by her partnership with Ferdinand, and how it became the driving force behind the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews. We've seen how this grand national quest for purity was mirrored in her bizarre personal habits. But we still haven't seen the full consequences of her actions. We've seen the persecution of her people, but we haven't seen the plague that her own personal filth would almost unleash. That, my friend, is the next chapter of our story, and it is a decidedly gross one. The weight of history hangs heavy in the air around you, a mix of grand ambition and crushing intolerance. The vision of a unified, pure Spain, forged by Isabella and Ferdinand, is a powerful one, but it stands in stark contrast to the physical reality of their court. We've touched on Isabella's personal asceticism and the rumour about her undergarments, but now it's time to truly get a sense of the magnificent, yet deeply contradictory world she inhabited. Imagine walking through the royal court, the centre of all power in Spain. The tapestries on the walls are woven with gold and silver thread, depicting scenes of chivalry and religious devotion. The courtiers, a collection of ambitious nobles, foreign dignitaries, and earnest clergymen, are dressed in the finest silks and velvets, their clothes so heavy and ornate they seem to move with a life of their own. The air is filled with the murmur of a dozen different languages, the clatter of silver platters, and the delicate notes of a lute playing in a corner. It is a place of breathtaking opulence, of material wealth that would be the envy of any monarch in Europe. And yet, beneath this glittering surface, there was a deep and troubling contradiction. While the court was a showcase of lavish spending and magnificent art, Isabella's personal life was one of almost monastic simplicity. She often wore simple wool dresses instead of the elaborate silks of her courtiers. Her meals were famously frugal, consisting of little more than bread, cheese, and water. She spent long hours in prayer, her knees calloused from kneeling on the stone floors of her private chapel. This was a queen who, in a world of staggering wealth, chose to live a life of spiritual poverty. She saw herself as a servant of God, and her personal asceticism was a public statement of her devotion. This stark contrast between the lavishness of her court and her own personal asceticism is a fascinating historical detail. It wasn't just a quirk, it was a deliberate choice. Isabella was making a point, both to her subjects and to God. She was saying, "My power and my wealth are not for my own pleasure. They are for the glory of God and the good of my kingdom." It was a brilliant piece of political theatre, a way to build her own moral authority and to project an image of righteous leadership. You can just imagine the courtiers whispering behind their hands, marvelling at the Queen's piety, even as they nibbled on expensive sweets and gossiped about the latest scandal. This is a point where historians still argue whether Isabella's asceticism was an act of genuine humility or an incredibly effective form of public relations. Was she truly indifferent to the world, or was she simply a master of her own brand? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a combination of both. Her faith was genuine, and it drove her to seek a life of simplicity. But she was also a shrewd politician who understood the power of a good image. She knew that by appearing humble and pious, she could win the loyalty of her subjects and silence the criticisms of her enemies. It was a strategy that paid off handsomely. But this spiritual focus, this rejection of the physical world, came at a cost. In Isabella's worldview, the body was a source of sin, and the pursuit of cleanliness was a worldly indulgence. The practice of bathing, which had been a common and celebrated part of life in Moorish Spain, was viewed with deep suspicion by the Catholic monarchs. The Moors had built magnificent public baths, places of beauty and social connection. Isabella and Ferdinand, in their quest to purify Spain, saw these baths as symbols of a decadent foreign culture. They were seen as places of sin and loose morals, and their use was actively discouraged. A quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit from this time is the royal decree that made it illegal to bathe more than twice in one's life, once at birth and once on the eve of one's wedding. Now, the historicity of this specific decree is debated, but the sentiment behind it is not. Isabella's court, and by extension her kingdom, embraced a kind of institutionalized filth. The smell must have been unbearable. Imagine a place where people bathed at most twice in their lives. The collective stench of a court full of nobles, all in their elaborate unwashed finery, must have been a powerful sensory experience. It was a world that we, with our modern sensibilities, can barely even comprehend. This isn't to say that all of Europe was a bastion of cleanliness, far from it. The Middle Ages and early Renaissance were, by modern standards, spectacularly unhygienic. But Isabella's court was particularly notable for its zealous rejection of bathing. This wasn't just a matter of poor plumbing or a lack of hot water. This was a deliberate choice, a spiritual statement. It was part of her grand vision for a pure and holy Spain. She believed that by rejecting the physical world, her kingdom would be all the more pleasing to God. This ideology of purity, while noble in its intent, had a devastatingly practical consequence. In a world with no understanding of germs, where diseases were thought to be a punishment from God or the result of bad air, miasma, the rejection of hygiene was a recipe for disaster. The castle, with its poor ventilation, its lack of sanitation, and its teeming population of unwashed people, was a perfect breeding ground for disease. It was a ticking time bomb, and Isabella, with her deeply held beliefs, was the one holding the match. The contrast between her lavish court and her personal asceticism is a microcosm of her entire reign. She was a ruler of contradictions, a woman who built a powerful empire and funded a voyage to the New World, all while living in a self-imposed state of physical squalor. She was a master of political and spiritual grandeur, but she was completely blind to the mundane, and ultimately deadly, realities of her own body and her own kingdom. She was so focused on the spiritual purity of Spain that she failed to see the physical danger she was creating. So as you stand in this magnificent castle, you can almost feel the presence of two separate worlds coexisting in the same space. The world of glittering wealth and political intrigue, and the world of quiet piety and bodily decay. This is the stage upon which our story unfolds. We've seen the woman, we've seen her ideology, and we've seen the contradictions that defined her. Now we need to get to the heart of the matter, to the most famous and unsettling rumour of all. The story of her unwashed undergarments, and the very real physical consequences of that strange vow. The smell is getting a little stronger now, isn't it? It's the scent of a kingdom on the brink, and a queen who was completely unaware of the danger she was creating. The air in the grand halls of the Alcazar of Segovia is heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and a pervasive human essence that no amount of incense can fully mask. You've walked through the magnificent halls, seen the opulence, and felt the spiritual weight of Isabella's reign. You've understood her motivations, her deep piety, her contradictory nature. But now it's time to get up close and personal, to examine the very real and very physical consequences of her beliefs. We're going to talk about the undergarments, or more accurately, the lack of them. We've already mentioned the legend, the story that Isabella vowed not to change her undergarments until the city of Granada fell. It's a story that has been passed down through the centuries, an almost unbelievable tale of a queen's fierce devotion. But where did this legend come from? Was it a malicious rumour, or was it a fact, a shocking testament to her asceticism? To understand this, we need to look at the clothing of the era. Forget everything you know about modern underwear. In the 15th century, what we call underwear was a far cry from the breathable cotton you have on right now. Women's undergarments were typically a simple linen chemise, a long, loose-fitting garment worn directly against the skin. This chemise was a crucial piece of clothing. It absorbed sweat and bodily oils, protecting the expensive outer layers of silk and brocade from getting soiled. It was the first line of defence against the body's natural processes. In a world with no dry cleaning, this was a vital function. The chemise was, for most people, the only thing that was regularly washed. So when we talk about Isabella's vow, we're talking about her not changing this linen chemise for 10 full years. 10 years of absorbing sweat, oil, and whatever else a person's body produces in the course of a day. 10 years of riding on horseback, of living in dusty encampments during the siege of Granada, of the heat and the grime and the general unsanitary conditions of the era. The thought of it is enough to make you wince. It's not just a matter of a little discomfort. It's a matter of persistent, unyielding filth. The source of this story, while often disputed by modern historians, has a surprisingly long pedigree. Some of the earliest accounts of Isabella's life, written by chroniclers close to the court, mention her extreme piety and her ascetic habits. While they don't always mention the undergarment detail specifically, They do talk about her self-imposed privations and her rejection of bodily comforts. It's not a huge leap to go from a queen who slept on a simple pallet on the floor and ate meagre meals to a queen who also refused to change her underwear. The story, whether literally true or a brilliant piece of symbolic storytelling, is perfectly in character for the woman we've come to know. A quirky and somewhat gross tidbit that lends credence to the story is the general state of hygiene at the time. Bathing, as we've already discussed, was viewed with deep suspicion. People believed that opening the pores by washing made the body vulnerable to disease. They thought that bad air or miasma could enter the body through these open pores and make you sick. This meant that most people rarely, if ever, bathed. Instead, they would use perfume and scented oils to mask the smell, and they would change their linen shirts and chemises to absorb the worst of the filth. Isabella, by refusing to even do this, was taking her asceticism to a level that was, even for the 15th century, pretty extreme. The religious symbolism of her vow is also important. In her mind, this wasn't just a physical sacrifice, it was a spiritual offering. She was dedicating her own body in all its grimy, smelly reality to the cause of God. She was saying, "My body's a temple, but a temple that is suffering for a higher cause." The filth was not a source of shame, it was a source of pride, a visible sign of her unwavering devotion. It was a kind of holy penance, a way to show God that her commitment was absolute. This is a point where historians still argue whether the story of the undergarments is a fact or a myth. There are no direct, verifiable sources that say Isabella went 10 years without a clean chemise. But there are plenty of sources that talk about her deep piety and her rejection of physical comforts. The story, whether literally true or not, has become a powerful symbol of her character. It represents her single-minded focus, her incredible willpower, and her willingness to endure personal suffering for what she believed was a righteous cause. It is the perfect, grimy metaphor for a queen who was so focused on the spiritual purity of her kingdom that she was completely blind to the physical impurities of her own body. The problem, of course, is that the physical and the spiritual are not so easily separated. While Isabella saw her filth as a spiritual offering, it was also a very real, very physical threat. We now know that germs, bacteria and viruses are the real culprits behind disease, not bad air or open pores. An unwashed body and an unwashed chemise is a perfect breeding ground for these unseen enemies. In a time when medicine was still in its infancy and doctors relied on things like bloodletting and astrology, a queen who actively encouraged a state of unsanitary living was a ticking time bomb. The legend of the undergarments, whether true or not, is the key to understanding the story that is about to unfold. It is the perfect visceral image of a queen who was so consumed by her spiritual quest that she was blind to the very real dangers she was creating. She was building a magnificent, unified kingdom on a foundation of filth, and that foundation was about to crack. The scent of her piety, so powerful in her mind, was about to become the stench of a spreading disease. We've seen the spiritual side of her story. Now, we're ready to dive headfirst into the physical and deeply unpleasant consequences of her beliefs. The smell is getting stronger, the air is getting heavier, and the stage is set for a quiet, almost imperceptible disaster to begin. You're still there, aren't you? The image of the powerful queen, so resolute in her filth, is a hard one to shake. We've established the legend of the undergarments, whether fact or myth, as a potent symbol of her piety and asceticism. But to truly grasp the danger this posed, we need to zoom out and understand the medical realities of the 15th century. This wasn't just a personal quirk, it was a societal norm that, when amplified by Isabella's fanaticism, became a catalyst for disaster. The world of 15th century Spain, and indeed most of Europe, was a spectacularly unsanitary place by modern standards. The cities were crowded, the streets were filled with human and animal waste, and the concept of a sewer system as we know it was non-existent. People threw their refuse out of windows, pigs roamed freely, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. It was a world that was constantly on the brink of an epidemic. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, had swept through Europe just a century earlier, and the memory of its devastation was still fresh in the collective consciousness. But no one, not even the most learned doctor, understood why. The medical theories of the time were, to put it mildly, a bit wonky. The dominant theory was the theory of miasma, or bad air. Doctors believed that diseases were caused by foul-smelling vapours that rose from decaying organic matter. They thought that if you could avoid this bad air, you could avoid getting sick. This is why people would carry posies of flowers or light fragrant herbs in their homes. It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was an attempt at primitive public health. They believed that by creating a pleasant-smelling environment, they were creating a healthy one. This belief system had a profound effect on hygiene. Since they believed that disease entered the body through the pores, they saw bathing as a dangerous activity. Water, especially hot water, was thought to open the pores, making you more susceptible to the dreaded miasma. This is why people would rarely, if ever, bathe. Instead, they would dry clean themselves with linen towels and change their undergarments. This was the closest most people got to a wash. The idea that a powerful monarch, who was already a trendsetter in her own right, would actively discourage bathing was not just a personal choice, it was an endorsement of a dangerous medical theory. A quirky and rather unpleasant tidbit from this era is the use of crocodile dung as a sort of primitive sunscreen or cosmetic paste. People would mix it with scented oils and apply it to their skin, believing it would whiten their complexion and protect them from the sun. The thought of it is enough to make you wince, but in a world with no understanding of bacteria, it made perfect sense. It was a time of strange and desperate remedies, a time when people were groping in the dark trying to understand a world that was constantly trying to kill them. But let's get back to Isabella. Her personal habits were not just a reflection of the times, they were an extreme version of them. She wasn't just a product of her environment, she was a leader who was actively shaping that environment. Her refusal to bathe, her vow about her undergarments, was a public statement. It was a royal endorsement of the idea that personal cleanliness was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. And in a world where the Queen was seen as a moral and spiritual guide, her example was a powerful one. Her courtiers, eager to please the Queen and to appear as pious as she was, would have likely followed suit. Historians still argue whether the medical understanding of the time was a genuine belief or a convenient excuse for a lack of sanitation. Was it a real scientific theory, or was it a way for people to justify a lack of plumbing and a general laziness? The truth is, it was probably a bit of both. The idea that bad air caused disease was a plausible explanation in a world with no microscopes. It was a way to make sense of a world that seemed completely random and terrifying. But it was also a theory that was incredibly dangerous, as it actively discouraged the one thing that could have saved lives: hygiene. The consequence of this was a court that was, by our standards, a hotbed of disease. The castle, with its lack of proper sanitation, its teeming population, and its general state of filth, was a perfect breeding ground for all manner of illnesses. The lack of bathing, the unwashed clothes, and the close quarters would have made it a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and other parasites. These tiny creatures, as we now know, were the real culprits behind the spread of diseases like the plague. They were the vectors, the unseen enemies that were silently spreading death through the court. And yet, in Isabella's world, these creatures were just a normal part of life. They were an annoyance, a minor discomfort, but they weren't seen as a source of disease. To her and her courtiers, the real danger was the devil, or a jealous god, or bad air. They were looking for a spiritual explanation for a biological problem, and their search was leading them down a very dangerous path. So, as you stand in the grandeur of Isabella's court, you can almost see the invisible army of germs and bacteria swarming through the air. You can almost feel the presence of the parasites, hiding in the elaborate clothing and the dusty tapestries. The air, so thick with the smell of piety and perfume, is also thick with the scent of an impending disaster. We've seen the medical theories of the time, the societal norms, and the bizarre personal habits of the Queen. Now we're ready to see how these seemingly separate threads, a powerful Queen's unshakable faith, a kingdom's adherence to a flawed medical theory, and the invisible menace of disease, are about to converge in a perfect storm. The stage is set for a quiet, almost imperceptible plague to begin. A plague that will start not in some far-off land, but in the very heart of the royal court itself. The air in the castle is getting heavy. The scent of unwashed bodies and musty tapestries now so pervasive it is almost a character in our story. You've seen the lavishness of the court and the stark contradiction of Isabella's personal asceticism. You've even understood the misguided medical theories that made this unhygienic lifestyle seem not just acceptable, but spiritually virtuous. Now let's paint a more vivid picture of daily life in 15th century Spain, a world of beautiful art and brutal filth, where the threat of disease was not a distant possibility but a constant companion. Step outside the castle walls and into the streets of a city like Segovia. The first thing that hits you is the sound. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones, the shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the constant low buzz of human activity. The second thing that hits you, however, is the smell. It's a symphony of unpleasant odours. The rich, earthy scent of animal dung, the acrid tang of urine, the rotting garbage piled in corners, and the pervasive, heavy aroma of unwashed people. There were no public sanitation systems as we know them. People simply threw their chamber pots out of their windows, a practice that led to a delightful little term for the streets: rivers of filth. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death. The streets, with their open gutters and piles of refuse, were a perfect breeding ground for rats and fleas, the silent vectors of disease. But no one, not even the most learned doctor, made the connection. They were still convinced that illness was caused by bad air or the will of God. This belief system led to some truly bizarre practices. For example, people would often wear thick woolen clothes to protect themselves from the bad air, even in the heat of summer. This, of course, would lead to more sweating, more filth, and more breeding grounds for the very creatures that were spreading the disease. It was a vicious cycle of ignorance and decay. A quirky and somewhat disgusting tidbit from this era is the use of animal fats and honey as a kind of primitive moisturiser or hair pomade. People would rub these substances into their skin and hair, believing it would keep them soft and healthy. This, of course, was another breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. It was a world where the very things people did to protect themselves were actually making them more vulnerable. You can just imagine the sight. A wealthy merchant, his hair slick with rancid animal fat, his clothes thick with layers of accumulated filth, walking through a street that was essentially an open sewer. It's a picture that, once you have it in your mind, is very hard to shake. The houses themselves were not much better. Even the homes of the wealthy were, by modern standards, incredibly unhygienic. The floors were often covered in rushes and straw, which would be left in place for months, accumulating food scraps, waste, and all manner of unspeakable things. When the rushes were finally changed, they were often so foul that they had to be dug up, not swept. The beds were often infested with fleas and lice, and the close quarters of family life meant that if one person got sick, everyone was likely to follow. The only real light and air came from open windows, which of course would also let in the bad air and the flies that were constantly buzzing through the streets. Isabella's court, for all its opulence, was not immune to this. The grand halls and magnificent chambers were still poorly ventilated. The lack of proper sanitation meant that waste was often collected in buckets and then disposed of, often carelessly, leading to a constant low-level threat of contamination. The sheer number of people living in the castle, courtiers, servants, soldiers, and priests, created a population density that was a recipe for disaster. One sick person, one cough, one fever, could quickly become a full-blown epidemic. This is a point where historians still argue whether the lack of hygiene was a matter of ignorance or a kind of religious fatalism. Did people genuinely not know any better, or did they simply accept disease and death as the will of God? The truth is probably a mixture of both. The medical theories of the time were flawed, but there was also a deep-seated belief that human life was short and brutal, and that the only thing that mattered was the state of your soul. A fever was not a medical problem, it was a divine test. A plague was not a biological phenomenon, it was a divine punishment. This belief system, while it might have provided some comfort in a terrifying world, also made people completely blind to the very real, very physical dangers that surrounded them. Isabella, with her fanatical piety, was the perfect embodiment of this worldview. She saw disease as a spiritual problem, not a physical one. Her own lack of cleanliness was a testament to her faith, a way to show God that her soul was what mattered, not her body. She was completely unaware that she was not just leading her kingdom on a spiritual crusade, she was leading it on a path to a very real and very physical disaster. Her personal asceticism, her belief that the body was a source of sin and filth, was about to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The stage is now set. You've seen the filth of the streets, the squalor of the homes, and the deep-seated ignorance that ruled the medical world. You've also seen the Queen, a woman of immense power and fanatical faith, who was actively encouraging this state of affairs. The two worlds, the world of spiritual purity and the world of physical decay, are about to collide. The unseen enemy, the bacteria and the parasites, are already in the castle, hiding in the elaborate clothes and the dusty corners. They are waiting for their moment, a moment that will be brought about by the Queen's stubborn piety and her tragic blindness to the very real dangers of her own making. The quiet ticking of the clock is getting louder, the air is getting thicker, and the smell is becoming unbearable. The air in the royal court, once so thick with the scent of piety and perfume, has begun to shift. There's a new note in the symphony of smells, a subtle, sickly sweetness that whispers of decay and fever. You're still in the Alcazar, the grand halls now feeling less like a fairy tale and more like a gilded cage. You've seen the filth of the streets and the ignorance of the medical world. Now, the danger is no longer outside the walls, it's inside, a silent, unseen enemy that has begun to take root in the very heart of the kingdom. It starts slowly, as these things always do, a cough here, a fever there. At first no one pays much attention. Fevers were a common occurrence in the 15th century, a fact of life in a world with no antibiotics and a terrible understanding of sanitation. But these fevers are different. They are more persistent, more violent. The people afflicted with them don't just get better, they get worse, their bodies racked with chills, their skin turning an ashen grey. The symptoms are baffling to the court doctors, who are still operating on the principles of the theory of miasma and the balance of the four humours. The four humours, for those of you who weren't paying attention in medieval biology, were a set of four fluids in the human body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Doctors believed that all diseases were caused by an imbalance of these humours. Their treatments were, to say the least, a little bizarre. They would prescribe things like bloodletting, a practice where they would cut a vein to let out excess blood, or they would use leeches to suck the bad humours out of the body. They also prescribed strange concoctions of herbs and animal parts, all in an effort to restore a balance that was in reality completely irrelevant. So, as the fevers begin to spread through the court, the doctors are completely at a loss. They can't explain it, and their remedies, far from helping, are actually making things worse. They are bleeding people who are already weak from fever, and they are prescribing strange, ineffective potions. They are looking for a cosmic explanation for a biological problem, and their search is leading them nowhere. They blame bad air, or a certain alignment of the stars, or the wrath of God. They are, in short, completely in the dark. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the use of animal blood as a kind of medicinal drink. People believed that drinking the blood of a healthy animal could restore the balance of their own humours. The thought of it is enough to make you wince, but in a world with no other options, people were willing to try anything. It was a desperate time, and desperate times call for desperate remedies, even if those remedies were in reality making things much, much worse. Isabella, for her part, sees the spreading illness not as a medical problem, but as a spiritual one. She sees it as a test from God, a trial by fire. She believes that the illness is a punishment for some sin, either her own or that of her people. She doubles down on her asceticism, spending even more hours in prayer and encouraging her courtiers to do the same. She believes that the only way to save her kingdom is to purify its soul, not its body. She is completely blind to the real danger, to the fact that her personal habits and the habits she has encouraged in her court are the very things that are fueling the fire. The plague, for that is what it is being spread not by bad air, but by the very real, very physical parasites that are teeming in the court. The lack of hygiene, the unwashed bodies, the infested clothing, and the close quarters are a perfect breeding ground for fleas and lice. And these creatures, as we now know, are the vectors of a whole host of diseases, including the bubonic plague. But no one in the 15th century, not even Isabella herself, makes this connection. They are looking for a grand cosmic explanation for a very small, very physical problem. Historians still argue whether the illness that began in Isabella's court was in fact the plague. The symptoms, as they are described in the historical record, are a bit vague and could be a number of things, but the speed with which it spread and the lethality of it point to a serious contagious disease. Whatever it was terrifying. It was an unseen enemy, a silent killer that was taking people one by one, from the most elaborate of gowns to the humblest of servants. The court, once a centre of life and power, begins to take on the air of a mausoleum. People whisper in corners, their eyes wide with fear. They avoid each other, hoping that by keeping their distance they can avoid the illness. The doctors, baffled and helpless, resort to more and more desperate measures. They burn fragrant herbs, they recite prayers, they bleed their patients. Nothing works. The illness continues its slow, insidious march, claiming a new victim almost every day. And in the middle of it all is Isabella. She's an island of certainty in a sea of terror. She believes that if her kingdom is faithful enough, if her people are pure enough, God will spare them. She's completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, are the very ones that are spreading the pestilence. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, is now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world has blinded her to a very physical danger. The unseen enemy is in the court, and it is flourishing in the very conditions that she, in her piety, has created. The stage is set for a quiet, personal disaster to become a national catastrophe. The atmosphere in the royal court, once a vibrant hub of power and plotting, has become a place of hushed whispers and thinly veiled fear. The sweet, sickly smell of fever and decay is now a constant companion, a grim reminder of the unseen enemy that has taken root. The doctors are still baffled, and Isabella is still convinced this is a spiritual trial, but the reality on the ground is getting much, much worse. The unseen enemy, once confined to the shadows, is now making its presence known in the form of a slow, insidious spread of illness. It starts with the servants. A kitchen maid, her hands chapped from scrubbing pots, comes down with a high fever. A stable boy, who has been working with the horses for years, suddenly becomes weak and disoriented. The illness, which the doctors are now calling the royal fever, seems to be striking at random, a terrifyingly indiscriminate plague. But if you were an invisible observer, a fly on the wall, you would notice a pattern. The people getting sick are the ones who are in close proximity to the Queen, the ones who handle her clothes, who prepare her food, who are in her inner circle. The source, though no one knows it, is emanating from the very heart of the kingdom. The illness begins to spread to the courtiers. A haughty nobleman, so proud of his lineage and his elaborate clothes, suddenly falls ill. A lady-in-waiting, so keen to be in the Queen's favour, is now lying in her bed, her body racked with chills. The fear is palpable. The nobles, who once vied for Isabella's attention, are now doing their best to avoid her. They make excuses to be away from the court, to go to their country estates, to escape the creeping death that seems to be emanating from the Queen's inner circle. They are, in their own way, making a very primitive and very logical attempt at social distancing. But Isabella, in her spiritual blindness, sees this not as a sign of a real, physical danger, but as a sign of wavering faith. She scolds her courtiers for their cowardice, for their lack of trust in God. She believes that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She's completely unaware that her own unwashed body is the epicenter of the plague, and that her call for her people to stay in the castle is a literal death sentence. It's a tragic, almost unbearable irony. A quirky and rather dark tidbit from this time is the use of plague doctors. These were not doctors as we know them, but men in a kind of bizarre costume, a long leather coat, a beak-like mask filled with fragrant herbs, and a stick to poke patients with. Their purpose was not to cure people, but to document the deaths. They were a grim sign of how widespread the disease had become, and their presence in the royal court, though they were not officially part of the Queen's inner circle, was a sign that things were getting very, very bad. The doctors of the court are in a state of utter panic. Their remedies, the bloodletting, the leeches, the strange concoctions, are doing nothing. They are looking for a cause, and they are grasping at straws. They blame the alignment of the planets, the wrath of God, and even the bad air from the swamp surrounding the city. They are completely and utterly blind to the real cause, to the fact that the disease is being spread by something so small, so simple, and so completely overlooked, the lack of hygiene. This is a point where historians still argue whether Isabella's court was a unique case, or simply a mirror of a more widespread problem in 15th century Europe. Was her court sicker than others because of her personal asceticism, or was it just the first place to get hit by a disease that was already spreading throughout the continent? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to her court being particularly susceptible. Her fanatical devotion to a certain kind of purity may have, in a strange and tragic twist, been the very thing that made her people more vulnerable. The Queen's stubborn refusal to change her habits, to even acknowledge the physical reality of the situation, is a perfect embodiment of her character. She is a woman of immense willpower, a woman who led a crusade against the Moors and funded a voyage across the ocean. She's not a woman who is easily swayed by fear or by the opinions of others. She believes, with an unshakable faith, that her way is the right way, that her piety is the only thing that matters. Her courtiers, who were once so in awe of her strength, are now seeing it as a kind of dangerous madness. The illness continues its relentless march. The grand halls of the Alcazar, once so full of life, now feel like a silent graveyard. The courtiers who are still there are moving with a kind of quiet desperation, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies racked with the unspoken knowledge that they could be next. The beautiful tapestries, the intricate carvings, the glorious paintings, they all seem to mock the human misery that is unfolding around them. The court is a gilded cage, a place of immense beauty and terrible creeping death. The stage is now set for a national crisis. The illness, once confined to the court, is now about to spill out into the streets. The Queen's tragic blindness, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, is about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now, we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The air in the royal court, once thick with the oppressive stillness of fear, is now being stirred by a new kind of activity. It's not the bustle of courtiers or the clamour of the kitchen, but a methodical, almost ritualistic campaign of purification. While the doctors were failing and the courtiers were fleeing, Isabella, in her spiritual blindness, was not idle. She was taking action, but it was an action that was completely disconnected from the physical reality of the situation. She was issuing royal decrees, not on sanitation, but on piety and personal habits. Imagine a scribe, his hands shaking with fever, a quill scratching furiously on a parchment. He's writing down the Queen's new royal edict, a document that she believes will save her kingdom. This decree, which was a real historical fact, though its connection to the plague is still debated, was a strict and unequivocal order. It banned public bathing in all forms. The decree stated that any public baths were to be closed, and that personal washing was to be kept to an absolute minimum. It was a royal endorsement of the very behaviour that was killing her people. Isabella saw this as a spiritual cleansing. In her mind, the illness was a divine punishment for the sins of her people, and the pursuit of physical cleanliness was one of those sins. She believed that the public baths, which had been a part of Moorish culture for centuries, were dens of iniquity and moral decay. By closing them, she believed she was not just getting rid of a source of disease, but also a source of sin. She was, in her own mind, killing two birds with one stone. Her belief in the divine nature of her mission was so strong that she could not see the very real and very physical consequences of her actions. This decree was not just a symbol, it was a devastatingly practical action. The closure of the public baths, which, for all their faults, were a place where people could at least wash themselves with some regularity, meant that even the most hygiene-conscious person in the kingdom had no choice but to embrace a more filthy lifestyle. The message from the Queen was clear. A clean body was a sinful body, and a dirty body was a holy one. The people, who were already terrified and looking for an explanation for the spreading illness, would have seen this as a divine command. They would have stopped washing, not just out of fear, but out of a misguided sense of piety. A quirky and rather dark tidbit from this time is the fate of the public baths themselves. After the decree was issued, many of them were not just closed, they were filled in with dirt and turned into pigsties or, in some cases, public execution sites. The message was clear. These places were not just unhygienic, they were unholy. They were a symbol of a past that was to be purged, a past that was deemed impure and ungodly. The very act of cleansing a building was, in the Queen's mind, a spiritual act of purification. Historians still argue whether Isabella's decree was a cause of the plague or simply a reflection of the bizarre medical theories of the time. Was she an active participant in the spread of the disease, or was she just a product of her own ignorance? The historical record is a bit vague, but the fact remains that her decree, no matter what her intentions were, created a perfect storm of unsanitary conditions. It was a recipe for disaster, a recipe that she, in her spiritual blindness, had personally endorsed. The consequence of this was immediate and devastating. The illness which had been confined to the court now began to spread through the city. The courtiers who had fled to their country estates and the servants who had been sent away with fever were now carrying the plague with them. The lack of hygiene, once a problem of the castle, was now a problem of the entire kingdom. The streets, which were already rivers of filth, now became places of sickness and death. The silent, insidious enemy was no longer a secret. It was a full-blown national catastrophe. Isabella, in the middle of it all, remained unshakable. She saw the spreading illness not as a failure of her policies, but as a sign of her people's lack of faith. She believed that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She was completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, were the very ones that were creating the plague. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, was now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world had blinded her to a very physical danger. The stage is now set for a national tragedy. The illness, once confined to the court, is now about to spill out into the streets. The Queen's tragic blindness, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, is about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The air in the kingdom is thick with the scent of fear and the terrible sweetness of death. The illness, which began as a whisper in the royal court, has now become a roar in the streets. You're no longer a fly on the wall in the Alcazar, but a ghost drifting through the city, watching in horror as the quiet, insidious plague takes hold. This is the moment when the personal tragedy of the Queen's fanaticism becomes a national catastrophe. The first signs of a widespread sickness were not subtle. People who had been living in a state of general filth for decades began to fall ill with a terrifying speed. The fevers, which had been a baffling mystery to the court doctors, were now a common occurrence. The people's bodies, which were already weak from poor sanitation and malnutrition, simply couldn't fight off the illness. The deaths, which had been confined to the inner circle of the Queen, were now happening in every neighbourhood, in every home. The kingdom, which had been on the cusp of a golden age, was now teetering on the brink of an abyss. The royal decree banning public baths, which Isabella had issued in a fit of spiritual zealotry, had a devastatingly practical consequence. The people, who had been told that a clean body was a sinful one, were now living in a state of institutionalized filth. The streets, which were already a breeding ground for rats and fleas, now became a perfect environment for the spread of disease. The illness, which we now know was likely a form of the plague or some other highly contagious bacterial disease, was being spread not by bad air, but by the very real, very physical parasites that were now thriving in the unhygienic conditions. The Queen's quest for a pure kingdom had, in a tragic twist of fate, created a filthy one. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the rise of the prayer brigades. As the illness began to spread, people turned not to doctors, but to God. They believed that the plague was a divine punishment, and that the only way to appease an angry God was through prayer and penance. These prayer brigades, a kind of primitive street procession, would walk through the streets, their hands clasped in prayer, their voices raised in a plea for divine mercy. They would often whip themselves with leather straps, believing that this self-inflicted pain would show God how sorry they were. The sight of these processions, so full of earnest piety and self-flagellation, must have been a terrifying one. It was a sign that the people had given up on science and medicine, and had turned to a desperate and ultimately fruitless attempt at spiritual appeasement. Historians still argue whether the plague of 1492 was a unique event or simply a bad outbreak of a disease that was already endemic in Europe. Was Isabella's decree a direct cause of the outbreak, or was it simply a factor that made a bad situation much, much worse? The historical record is a bit vague. but the anecdotal evidence points to her decree being a significant contributing factor. Her fanatical devotion to a certain kind of purity had, in a strange and tragic twist, been the very thing that made her people more vulnerable. The Queen, in the middle of it all, remained unshakable. She saw the spreading illness not as a failure of her policies, but as a sign of her people's wavering faith. She believed that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She was completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, were the very ones that were creating the plague. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, was now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world had blinded her to a very physical danger. The city, once a vibrant hub of life, now began to take on the air of a mausoleum. The streets, once so full of the noise of human activity, were now silent. The shops were closed, the markets were empty, and the homes were places of sickness and death. The people who were not sick were terrified. They stayed inside, hoping to avoid the bad air that they believed was causing the plague. They would only leave their homes for the most essential tasks, and when they did, they would carry a posy of flowers or a small bag of fragrant herbs, hoping to ward off the evil vapours. It was a world that had been turned upside down by a disease that no one understood. The doctors of the time, baffled and helpless, were now completely discredited. Their remedies, the bloodletting, the leeches, the strange concoctions, were doing nothing. People had lost faith in them and were now turning to priests and healers, to anyone who could offer them a glimmer of hope. The medical establishment, which had been so confident in its theories, was now a source of mockery and scorn. It was a moment of deep and profound societal change, a moment when the old ways of thinking were being challenged by a new and terrible reality. The stage is now set for a new kind of drama. The illness, which began as a quiet personal tragedy, is now a national crisis. The Queen's tragic blindness, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, has had a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now, we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The weight of the sickness hangs over the kingdom like a shroud. The once bustling streets are now eerily quiet, the air thick with the unspoken fear of contagion. You, as our silent witness, are no longer just observing. You're feeling the chill in the air, the collective terror of a population under siege from an enemy they can't see or understand. The illness, which began in the royal court, is now a full-blown epidemic, and yet in the heart of the storm, the Queen remains unshakable in her beliefs. This is where the story takes a turn from a tragedy of ignorance to a tragedy of stubborn, fanatical resolve. Isabella, in the face of mounting death and panic, did not waver. She saw the plague not as a medical problem but as a spiritual test, a sign that God was still angry with her kingdom. She doubled down on her asceticism, spending more hours in prayer, her body racked not just with the discomfort of her unwashed state, but with the emotional and spiritual weight of her kingdom's suffering. She saw the death and the illness as a kind of divine purification, a terrible but necessary cleansing of the kingdom's soul. Her devotion, once a source of strength and admiration, was now becoming a kind of dangerous madness. This is a point where historians still argue whether Isabella's actions were an act of genuine piety or a desperate attempt to maintain control in a situation that was spiralling out of control. Was she truly a blind zealot, or was she a shrewd politician who was using religion to justify her lack of action? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to her being a true believer. Her unwavering faith, which had seen her through her political struggles and her war with the Moors, was now blinding her to a very real and present danger. She was so focused on the spiritual purity of her kingdom that she was completely unaware of its physical decay. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the use of quarantine as a form of divine intervention. People, believing the plague was a divine punishment, would often isolate themselves in their homes, not to prevent the spread of the disease, but to show God that they were sorry for their sins. This was a form of self-imposed penance, a way to show God that they were willing to suffer in isolation. The practice, which we now know is the single most effective way to prevent the spread of a contagious disease, was being done for all the wrong reasons. It was a tragic, almost unbearable irony. The Queen, in the middle of it all, was the most stubborn of all. She refused to move the court, to leave the castle, or to change her personal habits. She believed that to do so would be to show a lack of faith in God. She was, in her mind, a beacon of piety in a sea of fear and doubt. She would not waver, she would not compromise, and she would not change. Her refusal to leave the castle, her refusal to change her clothes, and her refusal to wash her body was, in her mind, an act of supreme devotion. It was a testament to her unshakable faith in a world that was being torn apart by an unseen enemy. The illness continued its relentless march. The doctors, who were now completely discredited, were replaced by priests and healers. The remedies, the bloodletting, the leeches, the strange concoctions, were replaced by prayer, penance, and self-flagellation. The people who had been on the cusp of a golden age were now living in a world of fear and superstition. The plague, which was a biological problem, had now become a spiritual one. The kingdom, which had been on the verge of a new era of exploration and discovery, was now turning inward, consumed by its own fear and its own piety. The king, Ferdinand, was also at a loss. He was a pragmatic and clever politician, a man who understood the world in terms of power and strategy. But this was not a war he could win with an army, and it was not a political problem he could solve with a treaty. He was completely out of his depth, and he was watching in horror as his wife, the woman he had fought so hard to put on the throne, was leading their kingdom down a path of self-destruction. He saw her piety not as a source of strength, but as a source of weakness. He saw her stubbornness not as a sign of devotion, but as a sign of madness. He was in a terrible position, a king who had no power to save his own kingdom from the very person he loved. The court, once a centre of life and power, was now a silent, terrified graveyard. The beautiful tapestries, the intricate carvings, the glorious paintings, they all seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding around them. The Queen, in her finery and her filth, was the epicentre of a storm that was consuming her kingdom. Her stubborn refusal to change, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, was about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The illness, a silent and insidious killer, had found its way out of the confines of the royal court. Like a poison seeping from the heart of a fruit, the plague began to spread from the Alcazar of Segovia to the surrounding town, and then to the wider kingdom. You're no longer just a spectator of a royal tragedy, you're a witness to a national one. The fear, once a quiet hum within the castle walls, now echoes through the cobbled streets and across the open plains of Castile. The courtiers who had fled the castle in a panic, hoping to find safety in their country estates, were unknowingly carrying the plague with them. A duke who had left the court in a hurry arrived at his family home a few days later, a fever burning in his eyes. A lady-in-waiting, who had travelled a great distance to be with her family, brought with her not just her elaborate gowns, but also the unseen enemy that was hiding in the folds of her clothes. The plague, which had been confined to the royal court, was now being spread through the very people who were trying to escape it. The people of the cities and towns were completely unprepared. The royal decree banning public baths had already created a fertile ground for the spread of disease, and the general ignorance about sanitation and hygiene meant that no one was taking the necessary precautions. The sickness spread through the crowded streets like wildfire, taking a terrifying toll on the population. The beautiful art and architecture of the cities, once a source of pride, now seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding in their shadows. The streets, once so full of life, were now filled with the sound of wailing and the grim sight of death carts. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the use of talismanic objects to ward off the plague. People believing the plague was a divine punishment or a demonic possession would wear strange objects around their necks or hang them in their homes. These objects, which could be anything from a rabbit's foot to a piece of a saint's bone, were believed to have the power to protect them from the evil vapours or the wrath of God. The irony, of course, is that these objects, which were often handled by multiple people, were just another way for the disease to spread. The very things people were using to protect themselves were actually making them more vulnerable. Historians still argue whether the plague of 1492 was a unique event or simply a bad outbreak of a disease that was already endemic in Europe. Was Isabella's decree a direct cause of the outbreak, or was it simply a factor that made a bad situation much, much worse? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to her decree being a significant contributing factor. Her fanatical devotion to a certain kind of purity had, in a strange and tragic twist, been the very thing that made her people more vulnerable. The Queen, in the middle of it all, remained unshakable. She saw the spreading illness not as a failure of her policies, but as a sign of her people's lack of faith. She believed that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She was completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, were the very ones that were creating the plague. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, was now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world had blinded her to a very physical danger. The kingdom, which had been on the cusp of a golden age, was now being torn apart by a disease that no one understood. The people, who had been on the verge of a new era of exploration and discovery, were now living in a world of fear and superstition. The plague, which was a biological problem, had now become a spiritual one. The kingdom, which had been on the verge of a new era of exploration and discovery, was now turning inward, consumed by its own fear and its own piety. The king, Ferdinand, was also at a loss. He was a pragmatic and clever politician, a man who understood the world in terms of power and strategy. But this was not a war he could win with an army, and it was not a political problem he could solve with a treaty. He was completely out of his depth, and he was watching in horror as his wife, the woman he had fought so hard to put on the throne, was leading their kingdom down a path of self-destruction. He saw her piety not as a source of strength, but as a source of weakness. He saw her stubbornness not as a sign of devotion, but as a sign of madness. He was in a terrible position, a king who had no power to save his own kingdom from the very person he loved. The court, once a centre of life and power, was now a silent, terrified graveyard. The beautiful tapestries, the intricate carvings, the glorious paintings, they all seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding around them. The Queen, in her finery and her filth, was the epicentre of a storm that was consuming her kingdom. Her stubborn refusal to change, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, was about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now, we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The plague, a silent and insidious killer, had found its way out of the confines of the royal court. Like a poison seeping from the heart of a fruit, the plague began to spread from the Alcazar of Segovia to the surrounding town, and then to the wider kingdom. You're no longer just a spectator of a royal tragedy, you're a witness to a national one. The fear, once a quiet hum within the castle walls, now echoes through the cobbled streets and across the open plains of Castile. The courtiers who had fled the castle in a panic, hoping to find safety in their country estates, were unknowingly carrying the plague with them. A duke, who had left the court in a hurry, arrived at his family home a few days later, a fever burning in his eyes. A lady-in-waiting, who had travelled a great distance to be with her family, brought with her not just her elaborate gowns, but also the unseen enemy that was hiding in the folds of her clothes. The plague, which had been confined to the royal court, was now being spread through the very people who were trying to escape it. The people of the cities and towns were completely unprepared. The royal decree banning public baths had already created a fertile ground for the spread of disease, and the general ignorance about sanitation and hygiene meant that no one was taking the necessary precautions. The sickness spread through the crowded streets like wildfire, taking a terrifying toll on the population. The beautiful art and architecture of the cities, once a source of pride, now seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding in their shadows. The streets, once so full of life, were now filled with the sound of wailing and the grim sight of death carts. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the use of talismanic objects to ward off the plague. People, believing the plague was a divine punishment or a demonic possession, would wear strange objects around their necks or hang them in their homes. These objects, which could be anything from a rabbit's foot to a piece of a saint's bone, were believed to have the power to protect them from the evil vapours or the wrath of God. The irony, of course, is that these objects, which were often handled by multiple people, were just another way for the disease to spread. The very things people were using to protect themselves were actually making them more vulnerable. Historians still argue whether the plague of 1492 was a unique event or simply a bad outbreak of a disease that was already endemic in Europe. Was Isabella's decree a direct cause of the outbreak, or was it simply a factor that made a bad situation much, much worse? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to her decree being a significant contributing factor. Her fanatical devotion to a certain kind of purity had, in a strange and tragic twist, been the very thing that made her people more vulnerable. The Queen, in the middle of it all, remained unshakable. She saw the spreading illness not as a failure of her policies, but as a sign of her people's lack of faith. She believed that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She was completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, were the very ones that were creating the plague. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, was now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world had blinded her to a very physical danger. The kingdom, which had been on the cusp of a golden age, was now being torn apart by a disease that no one understood. The people, who had been on the verge of a new era of exploration and discovery, were now living in a world of fear and superstition. The plague, which was a biological problem, had now become a spiritual one. The kingdom, which had been on the verge of a new era of exploration and discovery, was now turning inward, consumed by its own fear and its own piety. The king, Ferdinand, was also at a loss. He was a pragmatic and clever politician, a man who understood the world in terms of power and strategy. But this was not a war he could win with an army, and it was not a political problem he could solve with a treaty. He was completely out of his depth, and he was watching in horror as his wife, the woman he had fought so hard to put on the throne, was leading their kingdom down a path of self-destruction. He saw her piety not as a source of strength, but as a source of weakness. He saw her stubbornness not as a sign of devotion, but as a sign of madness. He was in a terrible position. A king who had no power to save his own kingdom from the very person he loved. The court, once a centre of life and power, was now a silent, terrified graveyard. The beautiful tapestries, the intricate carvings, the glorious paintings, they all seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding around them. The Queen, in her finery and her filth, was the epicentre of a storm that was consuming her kingdom. Her stubborn refusal to change, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, was about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The air in the kingdom is thick with the scent of fear and the terrible sweetness of death. The illness, which began as a whisper in the royal court, has now become a roar in the streets. You're no longer a fly on the wall in the Alcazar, but a ghost drifting through the city, watching in horror as the quiet, insidious plague takes hold. This is the moment when the personal tragedy of the Queen's fanaticism becomes a national catastrophe. The first signs of a widespread sickness were not subtle. People who had been living in a state of general filth for decades began to fall ill with a terrifying speed. The fevers, which had been a baffling mystery to the court doctors, were now a common occurrence. The people's bodies, which were already weak from poor sanitation and malnutrition, simply couldn't fight off the illness. The deaths, which had been confined to the inner circle of the Queen, were now happening in every neighbourhood, in every home. The kingdom, which had been on the cusp of a golden age, was now teetering on the brink of an abyss. The royal decree banning public baths, which Isabella had issued in a fit of spiritual zealotry, had a devastatingly practical consequence. The people, who had been told that a clean body was a sinful one, were now living in a state of institutionalised filth. The streets, which were already a breeding ground for rats and fleas, now became a perfect environment for the spread of disease. The illness, which we now know was likely a form of the plague or some other highly contagious bacterial disease, was being spread not by bad air, but by the very real, very physical parasites that were now thriving in the unhygienic conditions. The Queen's quest for a pure kingdom had, in a tragic twist of fate, created a filthy one. A quirky and rather grim tidbit from this time is the rise of the prayer brigades. As the illness began to spread, people turned not to doctors, but to God. They believed that the plague was a divine punishment, and that the only way to appease an angry God was through prayer and penance. These prayer brigades, a kind of primitive street procession, would walk through the streets, their hands clasped in prayer, their voices raised in a plea for divine mercy. They would often whip themselves with leather straps, believing that this self-inflicted pain would show God how sorry they were. The sight of these processions, so full of earnest piety and self-flagellation, must have been a terrifying one. It was a sign that the people had given up on science and medicine and had turned to a desperate and ultimately fruitless attempt at spiritual appeasement. Historians still argue whether the plague of 1492 was a unique event or simply a bad outbreak of a disease that was already endemic in Europe. Was Isabella's decree a direct cause of the outbreak, or was it simply a factor that made a bad situation much, much worse? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to her decree being a significant contributing factor. Her fanatical devotion to a certain kind of purity had, in a strange and tragic twist, been the very thing that made her people more vulnerable. The Queen, in the middle of it all, remained unshakable. She saw the spreading illness not as a failure of her policies, but as a sign of her people's wavering faith. She believed that if they would only pray harder, if they would only show more piety, God would spare them. She was completely unaware that her own hands, in their fanatical devotion, were the very ones that were creating the plague. Her asceticism, once a source of strength, was now a source of deadly weakness. Her rejection of the physical world had blinded her to a very physical danger. The city, once a vibrant hub of life, now began to take on the air of a mausoleum. The streets, once so full of the noise of human activity, were now silent. The shops were closed, the markets were empty, and the homes were places of sickness and death. The people who were not sick were terrified. They stayed inside, hoping to avoid the bad air that they believed was causing the plague. They would only leave their homes for the most essential tasks, and when they did, they would carry a posy of flowers or a small bag of fragrant herbs, hoping to ward off the evil vapours. It was a world that had been turned upside down by a disease that no one understood. The doctors of the time, baffled and helpless, were now completely discredited. Their remedies, the bloodletting, the leeches, the strange concoctions, were doing nothing. People had lost faith in them and were now turning to priests and healers, to anyone who could offer them a glimmer of hope. The medical establishment, which had been so confident in its theories, was now a source of mockery and scorn. It was a moment of deep and profound societal change, a moment when the old ways of thinking were being challenged by a new and terrible reality. The stage is now set for a new kind of drama. The illness, which began as a quiet, personal tragedy, is now a national crisis. The Queen's tragic blindness, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, has had a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The stench of death and the cold grip of fear have settled over the kingdom. The quiet, insidious illness that began in the royal court is now a full-blown plague, and yet, in the midst of this national catastrophe, a glimmer of a different kind of light is beginning to emerge. It's not the light of faith or divine intervention, but the cold, hard light of reason. While the majority of the population was turning to prayer and superstition, a few forward-thinking scholars and doctors were beginning to suspect a more earthly and far more terrifying cause. You're no longer just a spectator. You're a ghost hovering over the library of a quiet monastery. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, and the only sound is the scratching of a quill on a page. A monk, his face pale with exhaustion and fear, is hunched over a series of scrolls. He is not studying the scriptures. He is studying the spread of the illness, its patterns, its victims. He is a member of a small clandestine group of scholars who have dared to challenge the prevailing wisdom. They are the first to suspect that the plague is not a punishment from God or a result of bad air, but a result of something much simpler and much more terrible. These scholars, who were often considered heretics by the church, were beginning to make a series of terrifying connections. They were noticing that the illness was spreading not through prayer brigades or in places of worship, but in the most crowded and unsanitary places. They were seeing that the people who were getting sick were not just the sinners, but also the most pious. They were starting to suspect that the illness was being spread by something small, something invisible, something that was thriving in the filth that was now institutionalized by the royal decree. They were, in short, on the cusp of discovering the concept of germs and bacteria. A quirky and rather dangerous tidbit from this time is the use of foul water as a kind of scientific experiment. Some of these scholars, in their quiet laboratories, would take samples of water from the city's open gutters and study them under a primitive microscope. They would see the tiny swimming creatures, the invisible army that was thriving in the filth. They couldn't explain what they were, but they knew, with a terrifying certainty, that they were connected to the plague. It was a moment of true scientific discovery, a moment of profound enlightenment in a world that was still mired in superstition and fear. Historians still argue whether these scholars were a unique phenomenon or simply a reflection of a wider, though still clandestine, scientific movement in 15th century Europe. Was there a secret society of scientists who were trying to figure out the cause of the plague? Or were these just a few isolated thinkers who were ahead of their time? The historical record is a bit vague, but the fact remains that there was a small, courageous group of people who were willing to challenge the prevailing wisdom and to risk their lives in the pursuit of knowledge. The Queen, in the middle of it all, was completely oblivious. She saw the plague not as a medical problem but as a spiritual test, a sign that God was still angry with her kingdom. She doubled down on her asceticism, spending more hours in prayer, her body racked not just with the discomfort of her unwashed state, but with the emotional and spiritual weight of her kingdom's suffering. She saw the death and the illness as a kind of divine purification, a terrible but necessary cleansing of the kingdom's soul. Her devotion, once a source of strength and admiration, was now becoming a kind of dangerous madness. The king, Ferdinand, was also at a loss. He was a pragmatic and clever politician, a man who understood the world in terms of power and strategy. But this was not a war he could win with an army, and it was not a political problem he could solve with a treaty. He was completely out of his depth, and he was watching in horror as his wife, the woman he had fought so hard to put on the throne, was leading their kingdom down a path of self-destruction. He saw her piety not as a source of strength, but as a source of weakness. He saw her stubbornness not as a sign of devotion, but as a sign of madness. He was in a terrible position, a king who had no power to save his own kingdom from the very person he loved. The court, once a centre of life and power, was now a silent, terrified graveyard. The beautiful tapestries, the intricate carvings, the glorious paintings, they all seemed to mock the human misery that was unfolding around them. The Queen, in her finery and her filth, was the epicentre of a storm that was consuming her kingdom. Her stubborn refusal to change, her fanatical devotion to a purity that was nothing more than filth, was about to have a devastating consequence for the entire kingdom. We've seen the illness take hold, we've seen the terror in the court, and we've seen the Queen's stubborn, tragic refusal to change. Now, we're ready to see the plague spread beyond the castle walls, and to see the full, terrible price of Isabella's fanatical devotion. The air outside the castle, once filled with the smells of the city, is now about to get a whole lot heavier. The plague has run its terrible course, leaving a trail of sorrow and empty homes in its wake. The stench of death, once a pervasive terror, is now fading, replaced by the grim silence of a kingdom in mourning. You, our silent witness, are now standing in the aftermath, the ghost of a plague-ridden kingdom. The Queen, Isabella, a woman of immense power and fanatical piety, is now an old woman, her body racked with a sickness that the doctors of her day, and even a few of the enlightened ones, cannot cure. This is the end of our story, the quiet conclusion of a life that was both magnificent and tragic. Isabella's reign, despite the plague, was a time of incredible change and achievement. She unified Spain, a feat that had been a dream of monarchs for centuries. She expelled the Jews and the Muslims, an act of religious intolerance that forever stained her legacy, but which, in her mind, was a necessary step towards a pure kingdom. She funded the voyage of Christopher Columbus, a decision that would lead to the discovery of a new world and the creation of a Spanish empire that would span the globe. She was, without a doubt, one of the most consequential monarchs in European history. But her legacy is a deeply controversial one. She's a queen of staggering contradictions, a pious woman who sanctioned the use of torture, a brilliant strategist who was tragically blind to the physical realities of her own kingdom, a unifying force who created a new kind of intolerance. Historians still argue whether her piety was genuine or a political tool. Was she a true believer, or was she simply a master of her own public relations? The truth, as is often the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. Her faith was genuine, but it was also a powerful justification for her most ruthless policies. And what of her personal habits? The legend of the undergarments, the vow she made in her spiritual zealotry, is still a subject of intense debate. Was it a fact or a myth? The historical record is a bit vague, but the anecdotal evidence points to it being perfectly in character. Her asceticism, her rejection of the physical world, her willingness to suffer for what she believed was a righteous cause, was the very essence of her personality. The story, whether literally true or not, is the perfect grimy metaphor for a queen who was so focused on the spiritual purity of her kingdom that she was blind to its physical decay. Isabella died in 1504, a tired and broken woman. She had watched her kingdom suffer, she had seen her own children die, and she had spent the last years of her life in a state of quiet despair. But even in her death, she remained a figure of immense controversy. She was, in the minds of some, a saint, a woman who had given her life to the glory of God and the good of her kingdom. In the minds of others, she was a fanatic, a ruthless monarch who had plunged her kingdom into a state of religious intolerance and physical decay. Her legacy is a complicated one, a tapestry woven with threads of greatness and cruelty, of piety and intolerance, of a brilliant mind that was tragically blinded by its own certainty. She was a woman who, in her quest for a pure kingdom, created a filthy one. She was a queen who, in her refusal to wash her body, almost brought plague to her people. She was a woman who, in her fanatical devotion, created a tragedy that was both personal and national. And so, we come to the end of our story. We've seen a queen of immense power, a woman who reshaped a continent, a woman who was a figure of both admiration and fear. We've seen her rise to power, her partnership with her husband, and her tragic blindness to the very real dangers she was creating. We've seen a kingdom of great beauty and great filth, a kingdom on the cusp of a golden age that was almost destroyed by a plague of its own making. And in the middle of it all, we've seen a queen, a woman who, in her own mind, was a saint, but who in the end was just a woman who was a victim of her own piety and a victim of her own time. The story of Isabella III of Castile is a cautionary tale. It is a story about the dangers of unchecked power, the blindness of religious fanaticism, and the terrible consequences of a great mind that is unable to see the small, simple truths of the world. It is a story about a queen who never changed her underwear and almost brought plague to her kingdom. It is a story that, in the end, is not just about a queen, but about a kingdom, a time, and a way of thinking that thankfully has been left behind. The air around you is getting still now, the sounds of the past are fading, and you are alone in the quiet darkness of the night. The story is over, the journey is done, and the queen, in all her glory and all her filth, is now a memory. The gentle hum of the fan, the soft glow from the nightlight, the feeling of the duvet pulled up to your chin, it's all part of this moment, this slow return from the past. The echoes of Segovia and the court's unsettling paradox are now just that, echoes. The weighty contradictions of Isabella's reign, her incredible achievements tangled with her disastrous flaws, can rest now. The silence of the night gives the final word, a whisper over a story that reminds us of the delicate balance between what we believe and the world we actually inhabit. May the lessons of history stay with you, not as burdens, but as quiet companions in the dark. Let the images fade now, the scent of musty tapestries and the weight of a kingdom in mourning. your mind is ready for rest, and the quiet peace of sleep awaits.